Klaule's first few days on Earth were filled with confusion and amazement. As a scholar from the planet Arcres, he had been raised in a society of pure logic, where emotions were viewed as weaknesses and indulgence in any form of excess was seen as a flaw. His species prided itself on mental and physical discipline, where every action had a reason, every feeling a purpose, and every experience a lesson in control. When Clow was assigned to Earth as part of a cultural exchange program, he was prepared to study the people, perhaps even to help them evolve beyond their perceived primitive tendencies. But when he saw humans consuming a substance they referred to as alcohol, a cocktail of intoxicating fluids, his scientific mind couldn't make sense of it. He first encountered humans drinking at a social gathering with his human guide, Jake, who had offered to show him the basics of Earth's social customs. They entered a lively establishment where the air was thick with noise, music, and the smell of various intoxicating beverages. Clow had read about human social gatherings, but seeing one firsthand was an entirely different experience. He couldn't understand how people could behave in such chaotic and erratic ways, laughing loudly, engaging in intense conversations, and, at times, acting with an almost reckless abandon. He observed how the people around him clinked glasses, their voices growing more animated as they drank. To Clow, this was anathema to everything he had been taught. Drinking was not only a waste of time but also a dangerous risk to both physical and mental health. It made no logical sense. His discomfort grew as the night unfolded. Humans seemed to be losing their inhibitions, but instead of deteriorating into violence or confusion, they appeared to become closer to one another. They shared stories, exchanged ideas, and bonded in ways that Clow could not begin to comprehend. But what unsettled him the most was how they seemed to find joy in their altered state. Their laughter, their open-heartedness, it was like a warm, unspoken connection that transcended words. He had read of these things in the theoretical writings of human philosophers, but seeing them in action was both fascinating and disconcerting. Clow's thoughts were interrupted when Jake handed him a small glass filled with a liquid he couldn't identify. "Go on, try it," Jake said with a grin, his voice thick with amusement. Clow hesitated. He had no interest in partaking in something that could potentially cloud his mind. He had read about the risks of alcohol, its effects on motor function, cognitive ability, and its potential for addiction. To him, it seemed a poison, a trap that no species with any semblance of intelligence would fall into. Yet there was something in Jake's eyes, a playful challenge, an invitation to understand, to see what humans found so captivating about this strange practice. The glass felt foreign in his hand, and he couldn't help but notice how his fellow humans seemed to treat alcohol with such casual disregard for its dangers. They consumed it freely, with no apparent concern for the consequences. This lack of control, this indulgence, was unsettling. Clow's mind raced as he considered the potential risks. What if this liquid caused the drinker to lose control entirely? What if it impaired their judgment permanently? In Arcres, even the smallest deviation from mental clarity was frowned upon. To witness an entire species willingly embracing a substance that could strip them of their faculties was nothing short of bewildering. But there was also something more beneath Clow's confusion, a sense of unease, as if this alcohol symbolized something far more complex than a mere substance. Perhaps it represented the very thing that his species had been taught to suppress: emotion, connection, vulnerability. As he observed the humans, he saw that alcohol was not just a substance. It was a catalyst for something deeper. People smiled more easily, spoke more freely, and somehow seemed more real, more raw. It was as though the liquid removed a veil that shrouded their true selves. It was this rawness, this freedom, that both repelled and intrigued him. After some hesitation, Clow took a tentative sip. The liquid burned as it slid down his throat, a sensation that sent a sharp sting through his senses. His face flushed immediately, his throat constricting as the alcohol's effects began to set in. He coughed and spluttered, not expecting such an intense reaction. His body rejected it at first, and he nearly spit the liquid out in disgust. But before he could compose himself, Jake was already laughing heartily, his face full of genuine amusement. "Don't worry," Jake said between chuckles. It takes a minute to get used to it. Clow felt something stir inside him, a slight warmth, an unfamiliar sensation that began to spread through his limbs. It wasn't discomfort, far from it. It was as though the liquid had unlocked something deep within him, something that his training had always told him to suppress. For a brief moment, the rational, controlled Clow that had spent his entire life focused on discipline faltered. He allowed himself to relax, to feel something, an openness that he had never experienced before. As the night progressed, Clow found himself watching the humans more closely. Despite their seemingly erratic behavior, they were all deeply interconnected, supporting one another in a way that felt foreign yet strangely beautiful. It was then that Clow began to realize that what he had initially perceived as a dangerous, mindless habit was actually something far more profound. The alcohol had the power to break down the barriers between individuals, to strip away the layers of pretense, and reveal something raw and true beneath. But that realization only deepened his confusion. How could a species so committed to survival and advancement embrace something so seemingly reckless? Why would humans intentionally risk losing control of themselves when their very survival depended on their ability to think clearly, to make rational decisions? He still couldn't fully comprehend it, but there was no denying that he had seen something beautiful in their vulnerability. For the first time, he wondered if perhaps humans weren't as flawed as he had initially believed. Still, there was a lingering doubt in Clow's mind. What if he was wrong? What if the dangers of alcohol were far worse than any of the humans around him cared to admit? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, that there was a greater understanding to be gained, an understanding that transcended logic, a connection forged through shared experience and raw emotion. But for now, he was left with more questions than answers. Clow's discomfort with alcohol only deepened as he continued to observe its effects on the humans around him. At first, it was just a curious phenomenon, a behavior that didn't fit with the logical framework of his upbringing. But soon, he began to notice something more unsettling. The alcohol wasn't just altering their perception or inhibitions, it seemed to be revealing something darker beneath the surface. People who had been quiet and reserved now became loud and aggressive. Those who had been friendly turned distant and cold. And at times, it felt as though the drink itself was unlocking a deep, primal rage within them, a rage that Clow had never encountered in his own species, nor had he thought was possible in humans. What troubled Clow the most was the idea that something so seemingly innocent, a drink, a mere liquid, could wield such power over an entire species. It went against everything he had ever learned. He was taught that the mind was a fortress, something to be guarded against external influence. That every emotion, every feeling, had its place and purpose, and should be controlled in order to maintain the integrity of the self. But here, humans were willingly surrendering their minds, allowing this intoxicating substance to chip away at their rationality, at their very nature. The more he thought about it, the more Clow began to see how alcohol was like a poison to their society. It didn't just dull their minds, it fed into their worst instincts, their fears, and their vulnerabilities. The horror of the situation became undeniable when he witnessed a heated argument between two humans. One had drunk too much, and the other, unable to handle the intoxicated one's erratic behavior, shouted back in anger. The words exchanged were harsh, and the argument escalated quickly. Clow watched, horrified, as their voices rose, their eyes narrowed with malice, and their bodies stiffened with aggression. He had never seen this side of humanity before, and it made him question everything he thought he knew about the species. It was as though alcohol had stripped them of their social facades, exposing the raw, ugly emotions that they kept hidden beneath the surface. Clow had read about anger in his studies, but he had never truly understood it until now. He had read about fear, jealousy, and hatred, but witnessing them firsthand was a different matter altogether. The human who had drunk too much was now trembling with rage, as though something inside him had snapped, and his entire focus was consumed by the need to lash out. Clow didn't understand how something as simple as alcohol could provoke such a transformation. In his world, emotions were subdued, understood, and processed in a controlled way. There was no room for impulsive behavior, for actions based purely on internal urges or desires. But here, alcohol made humans lose their sense of control. It made them forget the rationality that kept them from crossing boundaries, from engaging in dangerous behaviors. What he saw in front of him was not just an argument, it was the unleashing of something deep and dark, something that was part of their primal nature. As the argument continued, Clow felt a strange unease building inside him. He wanted to intervene, to stop the chaos, but he knew he was out of his depth. He had no idea how to navigate this human experience. He watched as the people around the two arguing individuals began to react, some trying to break up the fight, others simply standing back, unsure of what to do. This was the first time Clow truly questioned whether humans could ever be trusted with the same level of rationality and control that his people held dear. How could a species so unpredictable, so prone to emotional extremes, ever hope to survive in the vast, unpredictable universe? After the argument subsided and the crowd had dispersed, Clow tried to make sense of the experience. He sat alone, reflecting on what had happened. He had seen the power of alcohol, but it was not just in its ability to dull the senses or alter behavior. It was in its capacity to reveal the darker, more volatile aspects of humanity, the ones they had learned to suppress over time. The humans around him had shown him a side of their species that was raw, untamed, and frightening. And yet, even in that rawness, Clow could sense something else, a vulnerability, a need for connection, a longing to be understood. This realization sent Clow into a spiral of doubt. If alcohol was so dangerous, so capable of unleashing the worst in people, then what did it say about humans as a species? Could they ever truly be trusted to handle the complexities of galactic society? Could they control their darker instincts long enough to avoid self-destruction? Or were they doomed to be controlled by their impulses, forever bound to the unpredictable forces that govern their emotions? Despite the fear that gripped him, Clow also couldn't help but feel a strange admiration for the humans. They were messy, emotional, and often irrational, but they were also capable of something that Clow's species could never achieve: raw, unfiltered connection. In the midst of their emotional chaos, they sought one another out, they reached out for understanding, for companionship. They didn't hide their feelings, they didn't bury their anger or sadness. Instead, they wore them openly, often without shame. And there was something strangely beautiful about that. It was an idea that both disturbed and fascinated Clow. His species, Arcres, had long abandoned emotions in favor of a more controlled, logical existence. They prided themselves on their mental discipline and their ability to keep their passions in check. But what if they had lost something in the process? What if, by suppressing their emotions, they had become distant, isolated from one another, unable to form the kinds of bonds that humans so easily forged? Was it possible that this rawness, this emotional messiness, was actually a strength? Could it be that humans, for all their flaws and weaknesses, were more capable of true connection than Clow's species? Clow's mind swirled with these questions as he sat alone in the quiet aftermath of the chaos. He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Part of him wanted to return to the safety of his logical thinking, to reject the chaos he had witnessed. But another part of him, a part he didn't fully understand, wanted to embrace it. To understand it. To explore the depths of human emotion, even if it meant facing the darkness that lurked within. The night wore on, and Clow was left with the realization that his understanding of humanity was far more complex than he had ever anticipated. The alcohol had shown him a side of humanity he wasn't prepared for, a side that was unpredictable, dangerous, and yet somehow deeply human. And in that revelation, Clow felt both fear and awe. He had come to Earth expecting to study a species driven by logic and reason. Instead, he found himself face to face with a species ruled by passion, by emotion, and by the complex interplay of light and dark within each individual. And in that revelation, Clow began to realize that humanity was not simply a species to be studied, it was a species to be understood. Clow's growing unease about alcohol led him to delve deeper into his research about human behavior. Despite the immediate shock of his observations, he couldn't ignore a deeper question that had begun to form in his mind: What was it about humanity that made alcohol such an essential part of their culture? He had learned that different civilizations and species often had their own substances, some for ritualistic purposes, others for pleasure or relaxation. But none seemed to exhibit the same intensity or unpredictability as alcohol. It was an integral part of human life, yet it seemed to wield an almost uncontrollable power. Clow wanted to understand why. He started by asking questions of the humans around him, curious about their perspectives on the substance they seemed so drawn to. He began to realize that alcohol wasn't merely an intoxicating substance. It had layers of meaning for humans. For some, it was a social lubricant, something that allowed them to break down the walls of social anxiety and connect with others. For others, it was a way to escape the pain or stress that they could not otherwise process. But there was something even more troubling that Cloud discovered. For many, alcohol was a tool for self-destruction, an attempt to numb the deep emotional wounds they carried. Through these conversations, Cloud began to see the roots of the problem. Alcohol wasn't just a substance. It was a coping mechanism, a means of managing the overwhelming emotions that humanity often struggled to understand or control. Humans, unlike the Arcrees, had not developed the mental discipline to manage their emotional states in a balanced way. Instead, they turned to alcohol to help them cope with the chaos within. But in doing so, they allowed that chaos to take over. What Clow found most disturbing was the fact that humans, as a species, had never truly learned to face their emotions head-on. Instead, they had developed a complex culture of avoidance, where it was more acceptable to drown out pain, fear, and grief with a drink than to confront it. Alcohol was a shield, a way for them to avoid the vulnerability that came with emotional honesty. And in the process, it did far more harm than good. Clow couldn't help but compare humans to his own species. The Arcrees had long since abandoned their emotions, striving for mental clarity and control at all costs. Emotions, they believed, were the source of conflict, confusion, and disorder. By removing the influence of emotion, they had crafted a society that operated on logic and reason alone. And yet there were moments when Clow wondered if his people had sacrificed something essential in their pursuit of perfection. Perhaps the Arcrees had deprived themselves of the very thing that made life meaningful, the raw, unpredictable beauty of emotion. The human dependence on alcohol highlighted this gap between the two species. Whereas Clowless people had learned to suppress their feelings entirely, humans had taken a different path, one of coping with their emotions in ways that often led to destructive consequences. Clow began to view the relationship between humans and alcohol in a new light. The substance wasn't merely a tool of indulgence. It was a symbol of the deep psychological struggles humanity faced. Alcohol was the visible manifestation of their inability to process pain and fear in healthier ways. It was as though, by numbing their minds, they could temporarily escape the weight of existence. But that relief came at a cost. The more Clow thought about it, the more he realized how much alcohol was tied to the human experience of suffering. It wasn't just a tool for relaxation or socialization. It was a crutch for a species grappling with profound emotional vulnerability. This realization made Clow question how humans managed to survive at all. How did a species that was so deeply conflicted, so torn between raw emotion and the need for control, function in the vast, unpredictable galaxy? He understood that they had mastered technology, that they had created incredible societies, and that they had developed strategies to thrive. But now, faced with the complexity of their emotional lives, Clow wondered if humanity's most significant challenge wasn't external but internal. Was humanity doomed to remain slaves to their feelings, or could they find a way to master them, without relying on substances like alcohol? Clow found himself at an impasse. The more he learned, the more he saw how deeply alcohol was embedded in the fabric of human life, and how it played a role in both their strengths and weaknesses. But there was another side to alcohol that Clow couldn't ignore, and it became clearer the more he studied. Alcohol wasn't just something that humans used to cope with their pain, it was also something that brought them together. Despite its destructive qualities, alcohol had a unifying power. It had the ability to create bonds, to foster a sense of community, and to break down barriers between people who would otherwise remain distant from one another. Clow was forced to reconsider his initial judgment of alcohol. He had seen the violence, the chaos, and the emotional fallout it caused, but he had also seen something else. He had seen humans connect. Alcohol may have been a crutch for them, but it was also a tool for healing, for coming together in moments of shared vulnerability. It was a paradox that Clow could not resolve. On one hand, it was clear that alcohol was harmful, a dangerous means of avoiding the emotional complexity of life. But on the other hand, it was equally clear that it played a role in forging human connection, in helping them bridge the gaps between themselves and others. It was in this complexity that Clow found the true nature of humanity. They were a species caught between extremes, between the urge to suppress their emotions and the need to embrace them. They were creatures of conflict, constantly struggling to understand themselves and the world around them. But in that struggle, they were also capable of deep compassion, of vulnerability, and of connection. And it was through that connection, through their willingness to be open with one another, even at their most flawed, that humanity found its greatest strength. For Clow, the lessons he learned about alcohol became symbolic of the broader lessons he was learning about humanity. They were a species defined not by their perfection but by their flaws. And it was in their imperfections that Clow began to see the true beauty of humanity, a beauty that was raw, messy, and real. It was a beauty that could not be easily understood through logic alone. To understand humanity, one had to be willing to embrace the contradictions, the pain, and the uncertainty that made them who they were. And it was in that acceptance, that willingness to see the whole of the human experience, that Clow began to find his place in their world. Clow was struck by the sheer complexity of humanity's relationship with alcohol. It had become clear that alcohol served multiple purposes in human culture, serving as both a solace and a catalyst for emotional release. As he continued to observe and learn from humans, he began to realize that their connection to alcohol was far more profound than he had initially thought. It wasn't just an indulgence, nor was it simply an escape from pain. Alcohol had a unique place in human identity, one that cut to the very core of their vulnerability and resilience. For Clow, understanding alcohol wasn't just about studying a substance, it was about studying humanity itself. He had come to see that alcohol symbolized much of what humans struggled with on a daily basis, their battle with their own demons. It was as though they had created a mechanism for dealing with the emotional volatility of life, a crutch they could lean on in moments of desperation. But the more Clow thought about it, the more he realized that this reliance on alcohol revealed something much deeper about human nature, their need for balance, for release, and for connection. Humans were constantly walking a fine line between managing their intense emotions and giving into them. And alcohol was both a tool and a weapon in that ongoing internal battle. The terrifying realization that alcohol could bring out the worst in humans became more apparent as Clow's research deepened. He had heard stories about people losing themselves in drunken stupors, becoming violent or irrational. Some even spoke of alcohol's role in the devastation of families and communities. It wasn't just that humans consumed alcohol, it was that they sometimes allowed it to control them. The substance had the potential to strip away their self-control, allowing the darker aspects of their psyche to take over. But Clow didn't just see alcohol as a destroyer. He also saw it as something that could unite them, forging bonds between individuals in ways that few other substances could. Humans seemed to understand something about their own vulnerability that Clow couldn't quite grasp. Alcohol, for them, was both a means of navigating their weaknesses and an acknowledgement of their need for each other. It brought people together in moments of joy, laughter, and shared experience. It was a ritual, a way of participating in the world together and saying, in essence, "We are all here, experiencing this life together." For Clow, this was the paradox that defined humanity. They were fragile, yet they were strong. They struggled with their internal conflicts, but it was through these struggles that they found ways to connect. Yet, this bond forged by alcohol was fragile in its own right. Clow began to see the dark side of this unity, the fragile threads that alcohol often unraveled. He spoke to humans who had witnessed the destructive power of alcohol, relationships torn apart, families broken, lives shattered. Alcohol wasn't just a social tool, it was a dangerous force that, when misused, could erase all the progress humans had made in their attempts to control their lives. The very substance they used to cope with their emotions could, in the end, lead to their undoing. Clow reflected on his own species' reliance on control and order. For the Arcrees, emotions were a weakness, something to be suppressed and eliminated. They saw themselves as above the chaos that seemed to govern human existence. But in looking at the humans, Clow realized that the act of embracing that chaos, of confronting their emotions, rather than running from them, was, in some strange way, an act of strength. It was not the suppression of feelings, but the acknowledgement of them that defined humanity. And that was where alcohol played its greatest role, not as an enemy, but as a reflection of the human condition. In many ways, Clow began to see that alcohol was humanity's response to the same issues that plagued all sentient species. Every culture, every species, had its own methods for dealing with the inevitable chaos of existence. The Arcrees suppressed their emotions to maintain order, while humans used alcohol as a way to face the darkness within them. It was, in a sense, their way of surviving in a universe that often felt indifferent to their struggles. They found strength in numbers, in shared experiences, and in their ability to support one another through their most difficult moments. Alcohol wasn't just a substance for them, it was a bond, an acknowledgement that they weren't alone in their pain. But as Clow continued to observe, he couldn't ignore the harm that alcohol caused. It wasn't just the violence, the breakdown of relationships, or the destruction of lives. It was the way alcohol exposed the darker sides of humanity's nature. Beneath the laughter, the camaraderie, and the shared rituals, there was a darker truth. Alcohol allowed humans to give in to their impulses, to temporarily escape the consequences of their actions. It was a tool of temporary release, but also a gateway to deeper emotional wounds. In some ways, Clow envied the humans' ability to embrace their vulnerability so fully. The Arcrees had long ago decided that the only way to maintain control over their civilization was to eliminate emotional chaos. But Clow realized that this left them disconnected from the very essence of life. While the Arcrees were efficient and logical, they were also cold, distant, and unfeeling. In contrast, humans faced their inner turmoil head-on, and it was this vulnerability that made them so extraordinary. Alcohol, in many ways, was a symbol of their struggle to reconcile the chaos within and the desire for unity with those around them. At the same time, Clow understood that humans could not allow themselves to continue relying on alcohol as a means of coping. There had to be a way for them to address their emotional issues without the crutch of substances. The true challenge for humanity was learning to face their emotions without allowing them to spiral out of control. It wasn't just about control, it was about understanding the emotional complexity of existence and finding ways to navigate it with clarity, without relying on numbing agents like alcohol. Clow now saw alcohol in a different light. It was both a reflection of humanity's internal struggles and a bond that brought them together. But it was also a dangerous force, capable of destroying the very connections it created. The future of humanity, he realized, lay in their ability to embrace their emotions without the need to escape them. They had to learn to confront their darkness, to find strength in their vulnerability, and to build connections that weren't dependent on substances, but on true emotional honesty and understanding. This, Clow realized, would be humanity's true challenge, and their greatest triumph. Clow had been on Earth for weeks now, studying, observing, and absorbing the complexities of human nature. He had come to understand that while the human capacity for connection was vast, it was equally matched by the capacity for destruction. Alcohol had been an entry point, a means of understanding their emotions and their fragility. But it was clear that the real lesson he needed to learn lay beyond the substance itself. It lay in the human ability to survive, to grow, and to find redemption in even the darkest of circumstances. Despite the challenges humans faced in their relationship with alcohol, one thing stood out to Clow: their relentless drive to overcome their limitations. Even as they stumbled, faltered, and fell victim to their own impulses, they always found a way to pick themselves up again. This resilience, this refusal to let their mistakes define them, was something Clow had never encountered in his own species. The Arcrees prided themselves on their control, their detachment from emotion, but in doing so, they had closed themselves off from the very essence of life. They had built a civilization that was efficient, logical, and unyielding, but it was also devoid of the depth and richness that came with embracing one's humanity. As Clow reflected on his time on Earth, he realized that alcohol, in its most destructive form, was a mere manifestation of something far more profound: humanity's need for meaning. Alcohol wasn't just an escape, it was a search for connection, for comfort in the face of isolation and pain. Humans sought solace in substances like alcohol because they were trying to fill a void, trying to make sense of the chaos of their existence. But the true power of humanity lay in their ability to find meaning in the midst of that chaos, to build relationships and forge communities even when their world seemed to be falling apart. It was in this search for meaning that Clow found the key to understanding humanity. While alcohol had been a tool for coping, it was also a symptom of a much deeper need: the need to be understood, to belong, to be seen. Humans, in their frailty, had created something extraordinary in their connections with each other. Alcohol, for all its dangers, was only a temporary solution. The true answer lay in the relationships humans built, the way they supported each other through their struggles, and the way they learned from their mistakes. Clow could see now that it wasn't the substance that defined them, it was their capacity to rise above the darkness and find strength in the face of adversity. Yet, the more Clow observed, the more he realized that this journey of growth and redemption wasn't always a smooth one. Humans didn't always learn from their mistakes, and the consequences of their actions could be devastating. Alcohol, when abused, could tear lives apart, destroy families, and unravel the very fabric of society. But even in the face of such devastation, Clow saw that humans could rebuild. They could find a way forward, even when it seemed impossible. It was this ability to rebound, to heal, that set humanity apart from other species. While the Arcrees might excel at logic and control, they lacked the capacity to rebound from failure, to rise again after falling. For the humans, every failure was an opportunity for growth, every misstep a chance to learn. Clow began to see that this wasn't just a human trait, it was what made humanity the most resilient species in the galaxy. While other species might give in to despair, might allow themselves to be crushed by the weight of their failures, humanity had the incredible ability to keep moving forward. This wasn't just a survival mechanism, it was a profound philosophical understanding of life itself. To be human was to understand that life wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about avoiding mistakes. It was about how you responded to those mistakes, how you learned from them, and how you used them to create something better. This understanding led Clow to a deeper realization: humans were not defined by their failures or their flaws. They were defined by their ability to rise above them. This was where their true strength lay. Their resilience wasn't just about enduring hardship, it was about transcending it, about finding the courage to keep going, even when the odds were stacked against them. Alcohol, for all its dangers, was simply a reflection of the human desire to understand the limits of their own strength. It was a way to test those limits, to explore the boundaries of their own vulnerability. In many ways, Clow understood now that alcohol was a metaphor for the human experience. It represented both their greatest weaknesses and their greatest strengths. It was a reminder of how fragile they were, how easily they could be undone by their own impulses. But it was also a symbol of their resilience, of their ability to rise from the ashes and rebuild. Alcohol, in its darkest moments, revealed the fragility of human existence. But in its most redemptive moments, it also revealed the power of human connection, the ability to find strength in each other, and the drive to overcome even the greatest of challenges. Clow's final observation on Earth was perhaps the most striking: humanity's capacity for redemption. Despite their flaws, despite the many times they stumbled, humans always seemed to find a way to redeem themselves. Alcohol might have caused destruction, but it also sparked moments of clarity, moments where individuals found their way back from the edge. It was in these moments of redemption that Clow saw the true beauty of humanity, their willingness to keep going, to keep trying, no matter how many times they failed. And it was this, above all else, that made humanity the most unique and extraordinary species Clow had ever encountered. In the end, Clow came to understand that the true lesson of his time on Earth wasn't about alcohol or any other substance. It was about humanity's remarkable ability to learn, to grow, and to heal. Their capacity for resilience, for redemption, and for connection was what truly defined them. Alcohol, like everything else, was just a part of the journey, a tool they used to navigate the tumultuous seas of life. But it was their ability to find meaning in the midst of that chaos, their ability to support each other and rise above their flaws, that made them the most powerful species in the galaxy. It wasn't their strength, their intelligence, or their technology that set them apart. It was their hearts, their unyielding desire to find meaning, and their ability to turn even their darkest moments into opportunities for growth. And that, Clow realized, was the true power of humanity.